bridge too far. Metaphors for infusing multi-level governance and policy debates. And I think we'll have questions after each talk. I think that's the way most of these have been going. And we're trying to run until 6:15 or maybe a little bit after that. So each talk plus the questions will have to fit into 15 minutes or a bit over that to make that happen. So thank you.
Just a caveat.
Use the mic, please.
Okay.
The guy who doesn't need a mic.
The only one. Just one caveat. The views I'm going to express today on my own are not attributable to the USDA or the Economic Research Service. Start off by saying this is my first ecological economics conference, so I'm not an ecological economist. My specialty is in rural development, and if I were to put myself in a disciplinary home, it would probably be economic geography. But I see that there are economic geographers and ecological economists may be kindred spirits in one important respect. And the way I would frame that is to say ecological economics is to environmental economics, as economic geography is to new economic geography. So what I'm going to be, yes?
We're biophysical economists and we welcome you.
Thank you. Yeah, I heard about that little riff. Well, so what I'm going to talk about today is not ecological economics necessarily, but the power of metaphor that we've used in economic geography to try to dispel sort of the dominant role that new economic geography is playing in our discipline. This was covered in the Rhetoric Economics that Wojan wrote in 1983. A memorable metaphor has the power to bring two separate domains into cognitive and emotional relation by using language directly appropriate to the one as a lens for seeing the other. And the lens for seeing the other is the key here. I think all of us have personal experiences where we would, regard the statement as true. But what I'm going to talk about are the advances in science, in cognitive science and evolutionary psychology, suggesting why this statement is so powerful. So in terms of that outline, why are memorable metaphors so powerful? Talk briefly about the suspicion of metaphors as tools of simplification. That certainly has been the case in their use in economics. Talk a little about simple versus complex natural metaphors. And our application was using multi-level governance as tending a garden, the metaphor that we found productive. Okay, so the problem we faced was there was this debate in regional policy. The World Bank published a book called Reshaping Economic Geography, which I think a more honest title would have been Megacities, It Gets Better, in which essentially the argument was innovation requires agglomeration and density that happens in cities, that fuels growth, and so if countries want to develop most quickly, they should essentially not do anything to hinder the growth of global cities. The metaphor that they use to make the argument is global cities are the engines of growth. And so from our understanding of locomotion and the conservation of energy, if you have something that is the primary motivation for growth, you don't want it to do anything to impede that. The OECD, just about the same time, a few years later, published a book called Promoting Growth in All Regions. And their perspective was you should look for innovation and growth opportunities across the entire settlement hierarchy. And the critical problem there is a problem of local governance solving problems related to coordination problems that result from novelty and innovation. The major difference between them is that the World Bank had this wonderful metaphor for naturalizing the paradigm of new economic geography, the OECD did not. So this argument was accessible to people who were already members of the choir, but to no one else. I'll argue that paradigms are generally inaccessible things. The definition of paradigm is a framework containing the basic assumptions, ways of thinking, and methodology that are commonly accepted by members of the scientific community. So if your argument is going to be based merely on a shift in paradigm, you may bring along a lot of followers in the discipline, but you're not going to bring along a lot of followers in policymakers, journalists, or citizens. So to demonstrate the power of sort of natural metaphors, this logic problem, if a card has an even number on one face, it has the number of a primary color on its opposite face. Which two cards do you need to flip over to assess whether I'm telling you the truth? I'm not going to do a show of hands. You can write a note when you figure out this problem. But in thinking about the problem, just make a mental note of the difficulty in solving.
This is what you do at USDA?
What?
No, I'm kidding. Not the
Truth about what?
Sorry.
Okay, here's a parallel logic problem. New rule, if you're under 18, you cannot drink alcohol. Now, each card shown below has the age of a person on one side and the drink they're holding on the other. Which card do you need to turn over to see if the rule is being broken? Okay. I will take a show of hands. Who thought the first problem was easier? Who thought the second problem was easier? Okay. The first problem, if you want to know the answer, is 8 in purple. And in the laboratory, about 25% of the people did that, the correct answer to that question. I'm sure almost everyone here.
What's the correct one?
8 in purple.
8 in purple.
Telling you what truth?
Excuse me?
If the statement's true.
You have to turn over 8 in purple to see if you're telling the truth.
What truth are you talking about?
The statement.
The rule that only even number cards have primary colors. 80% of people get this correct. And the reason is because our hardwiring is built for detecting cheaters. So this problem is much more natural for us to solve, and it is, this provides perhaps the most visceral statement of, or visceral feeling behind the statement. Our evolutionary goals both navigate and structure our thoughts. And so this is the real power of metaphor. If you can, go back here. The 2016 update to Max Black would be good metaphors link a paradigmatic way of knowing the world with our hardwired programs for surviving in it. Whenever you can use Milton Friedman to make an argument that supports complexity or context, I think it's a good thing. You can use this to support Milton Friedman's as-if argument, in which he said the pool player doesn't know geometry, he can't solve that problem, but he knows it as if he were a master of geometry. The important distinction between those two ways of knowing, the rational, analytical, geometric way of knowing, and the non-rational way of knowing, is that the mathematician has an irrefutable representation of the truth. The pool player has an ineffable sense of the truth of the matter. And so that is where the power of metaphor really comes in terms of trying to convince a policymaker, a journalist, a citizen of the correctness of your way of thinking of a problem. I revisited Ostrom's book, Governing the Commons, in preparing for this talk, and I was struck by the way she really sort of demonizes metaphors as tools of simplification. And clearly, if you think of economics as social physics, the easiest sort of natural metaphors to rely on are those that exploit the first law of thermodynamics. If you're thinking of economics as a sustainable science, sustainability, it's better suited to the second law of thermodynamics. So, in the World Bank's Reshaping Economic Geography, their successful anthropomorphic transformation of the dialectical problem is based on being able to find a natural lens for seeing a complex problem. It wasn't done by convincing them that, in fact, it's better to be a neoclassical economist. So, in that way, the metaphor worked as a paradigmatic way of knowing the world linked to the neural machinery to solve specialized problems of locomotion and conservation of energy. So the critical question for ecological economists is whether the neural machinery is concerned with order and decay in open systems. There's a very interesting article called "The Second Law of Thermodynamics is the First Law of Evolutionary Psychology," suggesting that those rules and instincts and habits we have for sustaining functional order are probably burned pretty deep down in our neural machinery. Which, flipping it on its head, the question is optimization merely a contrived objective relative to the survival instinct of balancing exploitation with exploration? So, a simple example of this from Reshaping Economic Geography, the World Bank publication. This is essentially the map they use to convince everyone that since this is economic activity, the density of economic activity per square mile, and their suggestion is because innovation requires agglomeration and density, since innovation fuels growth, the fastest way to develop your country is essentially to promote growth in the urban agglomeration. In terms of if your strategy is merely optimization, it makes perfect sense. A sufficient statistic for differentiated pathways of growth is essentially to look at the problem beyond merely trying to optimize something like economic growth and ask about the probability of historic century floods over the next 20 years due to global warming. And if one were to compare that map to this map, that might raise some questions in a reader's mind or policymaker's mind as to the appropriability of pursuing the World Bank strategy. So, in conclusion, this is a quote from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. If we want to push the envelope of complexity further, we have to use all of our devices for accessing information, not all of which are rational. And in terms of, it's not merely storytelling, it's not merely literary flourishes, it's essentially trying to graft your ideas onto the hardwiring that each of us possess. If you'd like to read more about these arguments, it was recently published in Regional Studies, Metaphors of Regional Policy. If you Google that, the article should come up. And I thank you for your time.
So this term of arithmomorphic.
Arithmomorphic.
Yeah. So this is your the paradigm of presenting in contrast, correct?
And what exactly is that getting at in contrast to like the neoliberal concept?
The neoliberal concept is an arithmomorphic concept.
Okay.
That is saying we can take dialectical problems, we can take these complex problems, which may have many dimensions, and reduce it to a problem of numbers. We can quantify those things.
Are per capita innovations highest in concentrated cities? I'm thinking of James Watt.
Per capita innovations probably are, but I would ask you, why would per capita innovations make any sense? Because a lot of
Well, because of course you're going to have more innovations where you have more people.
Well, no, but not all people are going to be involved in the process of invention or innovation. Farmers. My favorite example of this is Stuttgart more innovative than Paris? If you look at per capita, Stuttgart is more innovative than Paris. That's because no one, except for auto engineers, want to live in Stuttgart. Everyone wants to live in Paris.
That's it, yes. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your name, but yes.
Richard? As we're learning, much to our dismay, it's not the professionals and the intelligentsia who are making these decisions, or let's say decisions that the intelligentsia might make, are not necessarily acceptable to people who are not at the cutting edge of rational thinking. And also, we're using all sorts of complex models that none of us are able to intuitively guess what the outcomes will be, which is why we're developing the models in the first place. So we have a substitute mentality that is neither natural or intellectual that we're using as a surrogate for what human beings can do in and of themselves. But I don't understand that since we've moved well into that era, how that squares with the kind of model you're presenting us.
Well, I mean, you made the point yourself that the people aren't understanding that, policymakers aren't understanding that, and as a result, I mean, if you bring a well-reasoned argument that's based on these complex models, but there's no basis for truly believing that, then it's not going to be very persuasive to those people. And I think the debate of global warming is a perfect example of that.
Who hasn't asked the question?
Well, I'd just like to say I really appreciate the presentation, and that for boiling complex things down into simplistic terms like metaphor to convey ideas, and also that if you're going to talk about paradigm change, there's no point in trying to talk to everybody. There's only going to be a few people listening anyhow, and that's very important.
I think we should probably go on to the next talk. Okay, no, it's.
If I want to make a hike, I could ask a shepherd how the weather is tomorrow. And he'll say, oh, there are blue skies and now it's red at night, and you can go tomorrow on a hike. But if I want to fly to Europe, I'll ask a meteorological institute whether I should go or not. This means I would not rely on ideas on a very important thing. I don't think you can run a big company without knowing very specific things.
No, exactly. The idea is, that's the problem that Ostrom had with the use of metaphor, that she saw it as a way of simplifying. We're not saying that you should use the metaphor as a substitute for scientific knowledge. What we're saying is if you want to bring more people into the conversation, you have to graft the rational conceptual ideas of your explanation onto our hard wiring. And the best way to do that is to find a metaphor that can make the link between the two. It's not just a metaphor. Both the World Bank, in their discussion, they go into some depth in terms of how their metaphor relates to something they call development in 3D. Similarly, with if you're using a garden metaphor to talk about development, there is also, you could relate it to evolutionary principles about differentiation, selection, and amplification as well. So the metaphor is the starting point, not the answer.